In the early hours of a misty autumn morning, the sky was a blend of purples and grays, as if the night was reluctantly surrendering to the dawn. The millionaire, Alexander Rowe, a man whose name had become synonymous with wealth and power, was driving his custom-made, sleek black sedan through the winding roads of the countryside. He had always preferred these drives over the sterile luxury of private jets or helicopters. There was something liberating about the solitude, the open road, and the quiet hum of the engine. But this morning was different. The atmosphere felt thick, oppressive even, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Alexander noticed the unease in the pit of his stomach, but he dismissed it as nothing more than his imagination. After all, what did he, one of the most influential men in the world, have to fear? The road ahead seemed to stretch endlessly, with the towering trees on either side creating a tunnel-like effect. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the asphalt. Alexander's thoughts wandered to the business meeting he was headed to, a negotiation that could potentially increase his already vast fortune. He smirked to himself, confident in his ability to sway any deal in his favor. As he rounded a particularly sharp bend, the fog thickened, reducing visibility to mere meters. It was then that he noticed something odd, a flicker of movement in the corner of his eye. He instinctively slowed down, squinting through the haze. His pulse quickened as he realized what he was seeing. A large truck parked sideways across the road, blocking both lanes. That Alexander's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't an ordinary roadblock. The truck was old, rusted, and seemed out of place on this remote stretch of road. His mind raced as he considered his options. He could try to reverse and speed away, but the narrow road left little room for maneuvering. Before he could make a decision, his worst fears were confirmed. From behind the trees, several figures emerged, dressed in dark, ragged clothing, their faces obscured by masks. They moved quickly, with the precision of a well-rehearsed operation. Alexander's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him. This was an ambush. The men surrounded his car in seconds, one of them tapping on the driver's side window with the barrel of a shotgun. The sound was sharp, a harsh reminder that he was trapped. Alexander's hands tightened on the steering wheel as he struggled to maintain his composure. The man outside gestured for him to lower the window. With no other choice, Alexander complied. The window slid down with a quiet whir, and the man leaned in, his cold eyes locking onto Alexander's. "Step out of the car," the man ordered, his voice low and menacing. There was no hint of emotion, no indication of who he was or what he wanted. But Alexander knew better than to argue. He slowly unbuckled his seatbelt, his movements deliberate to avoid provoking the armed men. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. Who were they? What did they want? Ransom, perhaps? But then why such an elaborate setup? As he stepped out of the car, he felt the dampness of the morning dew on the ground seep through his expensive leather shoes. The air was heavy with the scent of earth and decay, the silence around them almost deafening. The men closed in on him, their presence suffocating. "Turn around," the leader commanded. Alexander did as he was told, his heart pounding in his chest. He felt a rough hand grab his wrists, pulling them behind his back. The sharp click of handcuffs locking into place sent a jolt of panic through him. This was no ordinary kidnapping. These men were professionals, and they had planned this meticulously. Before he could react, a cloth bag was shoved over his head, plunging him into darkness. The world around him became a muffled echo, the sound of the men's footsteps and the rustling of leaves blending into a chaotic symphony. He was roughly pushed forward, stumbling as they forced him toward the truck. Inside the bag, Alexander's mind raced. He had faced many challenges in his life, built an empire from the ground up, but this was different. This was a threat he couldn't control with money or influence. His thoughts flashed to his family, his wife and children, and the fear for their safety gnawed at him. He couldn't let these men get the upper hand. He had to find a way out. But for now, he was powerless. They shoved him into the back of the truck, the cold metal floor biting through his clothes. The door slammed shut with a finality that echoed in the confined space. He was alone, in complete darkness, the sound of the engine roaring to life the only indication that the truck was moving. Time lost all meaning as they drove. Alexander tried to keep track of the turns, the bumps in the road, anything that could give him a clue about where they were taking him. But the disorientation from the bag over his head, combined with the erratic driving, made it impossible. He could feel the fear growing inside him, threatening to take over. But he forced himself to stay calm, to think rationally. There had to be a way out of this. Suddenly, the truck came to a halt. The silence that followed was suffocating, the tension in the air so thick it was almost tangible. Alexander strained to hear anything that could give him a clue about what was happening outside. Footsteps, low voices, speaking in hurried, muffled tones. The creak of the truck's doors as they were opened. Then, without warning, the door to his prison was yanked open. Rough hands grabbed him, pulling him out of the truck and onto the ground. The bag was ripped off his head, and he blinked against the harsh light of the morning sun. He was in a clearing, surrounded by dense forest, far from any sign of civilization. The men stood in a semicircle around him, their faces still hidden behind masks. The leader stepped forward, his cold eyes boring into Alexander's. "You're going to cooperate," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. "Or things will get very unpleasant for you." Alexander didn't doubt him for a second, but he was determined not to let these men see his fear. He straightened up, meeting the leader's gaze with as much defiance as he could muster. "What do you want?" he demanded, his voice steadier than he expected. The leader didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a phone, holding it up for Alexander to see. The screen displayed a video call, the image shaky and pixelated. Alexander's heart dropped as he recognized the faces on the screen. His wife, Emily, and his 2 children, their faces pale with fear. "If you want to see them again," the leader said, his voice dripping with malice, "you're going to do exactly as we say." Alexander's world tilted on its axis. The sight of his family, terrified and at the mercy of these men, broke through his carefully constructed facade of control. He felt the ground slipping away from beneath him, the terror clawing at his chest. But he couldn't let them win. He had to stay strong for them. "What do you want?" he repeated, his voice now tinged with desperation. The leader smiled, a cruel, twisted expression that sent chills down Alexander's spine. "All in good time," he said. "For now, you just need to know that we're watching. One wrong move, and they die." Alexander swallowed hard, the weight of their situation pressing down on him like a physical force. He had no choice but to comply, to play their game. But even as the despair threatened to overwhelm him, a spark of determination flared in his chest. He would find a way out of this. He had to. The leader motioned to the others, and Alexander was roughly pushed toward the edge of the clearing, where a small, nondescript car was waiting. They forced him inside, 2 of the men joining him in the back seat, their weapons trained on him. The leader took the driver's seat, starting the engine with a low rumbled as the car pulled away. The dense forest swallowed them up, the morning light barely penetrating the thick canopy of trees. Alexander stared out the window, his mind racing with thoughts of escape, of how he could outsmart these men and save his family. But deep down, he knew this was only the beginning of a nightmare that was far from over. The road ahead was uncertain, shrouded in darkness and danger. But Alexander Rowe was not a man who gave up easily. He would fight, he would survive, and he would save his family, no matter what it took. And so, the journey into the unknown began, with the shadow of fear looming over every mile. The car sped through the winding forest roads, the trees blurring into a dark green mass as Alexander Rowe sat silently in the back seat, flanked by 2 of his captors. The leader, still masked, gripped the steering wheel with one hand, while the other rested casually on the pistol in his lap. The tension in the small vehicle was palpable, each man's breath heavy and deliberate, the only sound accompanying the roar of the engine and the crunch of gravel under the tires. To Alexander's mind was a maelstrom of thoughts and emotions. The image of his family's frightened faces from the video call replayed in his mind, their fear fueling his resolve. He knew he had to get out, to find a way to free himself from these men before they could carry out whatever malevolent plan they had in store. But he also knew he had to be careful. One wrong move could cost him his life, or worse, the lives of his wife and children. The men beside him seemed relaxed, perhaps too relaxed, their confidence evident in the way they barely acknowledged him. They saw him as a wealthy businessman, unaccustomed to violence or danger, someone who would easily be subdued and controlled. But Alexander was more than just a figurehead of a corporate empire. He was a man who had fought his way to the top, who had faced countless adversities and emerged victorious. This, however, was a battle of a different kind, a battle for survival. As they drove deeper into the forest, the road began to narrow, the tall trees pressing in on both sides, casting long shadows that danced across the car's windshield. Alexander noticed the driver was slowing down, navigating the tight bends with caution. This was his moment, his one chance to turn the tables. He glanced at the men beside him. Their attention momentarily diverted as the car hit a particularly sharp turn. His eyes caught sight of the keys dangling from the ignition, swaying slightly with the motion of the car. An idea began to form in his mind, a risky, potentially deadly idea, but one that might just give him the upper hand. He shifted slightly in his seat, testing the reaction of the men beside him. They barely noticed their focus on the road ahead. His hands, still cuffed behind his back, felt the cool metal of the seatbelt buckle. Slowly, carefully, he began to press his fingers against the release button, his heart pounding in his chest. The click of the buckle echoed loudly in his ears, but the sound was swallowed by the noise of the engine that he waited, breath held, to see if they had noticed. But the men remained oblivious, their eyes fixed on the road. Alexander's mind raced, calculating the timing and the angle, knowing he would have only one chance to execute his plan. Suddenly, the car swerved to avoid a fallen branch on the road, the vehicle jolting as the tires scraped against the gravel. In that split second, Alexander made his move. With a swift, fluid motion, he threw himself forward, his fingers hooking around the keys and the ignition. He twisted them sharply, yanking them out, and at the same time, he used his momentum to slam his shoulder into the man on his right. The man grunted in surprise as the car's engine sputtered and died, the vehicle lurching to a halt. The driver cursed loudly, his hands scrambling to restart the car, but the keys were already in Alexander's grasp. The man on Alexander's left reacted quickly, grabbing for his gun, but Alexander was faster. With a desperate shove, he pushed the door open with his shoulder, rolling out of the car and onto the rough ground below. Pain shot through his body as he hit the ground hard, but he didn't stop. He scrambled to his feet, the handcuffs biting into his wrists as he bolted toward the dense undergrowth. Behind him, he heard the shouts of his captors, their voices angry and laced with panic. He didn't dare look back, didn't dare slow down. His only thought was to get away, to put as much distance between himself and those men as possible. The forest was a labyrinth of twisted roots and thick foliage, the ground uneven and treacherous. Branches scratched at his face and arms, the damp earth slipping beneath his feet. But adrenaline pushed him forward, driving him deeper into the woods. He could hear the men crashing through the undergrowth behind him, their shouts growing louder as they gave chase. His breath came in ragged gasps, his lungs burning from the effort. He knew he couldn't keep up this pace for long, but he also knew he couldn't afford to stop. The darkness of the forest enveloped him, the thick canopy above blocking out the light. He needed to think, to find some way to evade them, but his mind was a blur, his thoughts drowned out by the pounding of his heart. Suddenly, he stumbled over a protruding root, his ankle twisting painfully as he crashed to the ground. A sharp cry escaped his lips, but he bit down on it, forcing himself to stay quiet. He lay there for a moment, the pain radiating up his leg, his body trembling with exhaustion. He could hear the men getting closer, their footsteps heavy and relentless. He had to move, had to keep going, but his body refused to cooperate. The sound of a gunshot rang out, piercing the silence of the forest. Alexander's heart leaped into his throat as the bullet whizzed past him, embedding itself into a tree just inches from his head. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. They weren't just trying to capture him. They were willing to kill him. Fear surged through him, giving him the strength to push himself back onto his feet. He limped forward, his injured ankle screaming in protest with every step, but he couldn't stop, not now. He had to find a way out, had to find some place to hide. His eyes scanned the forest, looking for anything that could offer shelter. Through the thick undergrowth, he spotted a small, rocky outcrop jutting out from the side of a hill. It wasn't much, but it was his only hope. He forced his legs to move faster, each step a battle against the pain. The shouts of the men were getting louder, their footsteps closing in. He could feel their presence like a weight on his back, pushing him forward with a primal instinct for survival. Finally, he reached the outcrop, throwing himself behind the large rocks just as another gunshot rang out. The bullet ricocheted off the stone, sending shards of rock flying in all directions. Alexander curled up into a ball, trying to make himself as small as possible. His breath coming in shallow, panicked bursts, he pressed his back against the cold, rough surface of the rocks, listening intently to the sounds of the forest. The footsteps were closer now, too close. He could hear them moving through the undergrowth, the crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot. He held his breath, every muscle in his body tensed, waiting for the moment when they would find him. Seconds stretched into minutes, the silence between each footstep unbearable. He could hear their voices now, low and threatening, as they searched for him. They were close, so close that he could hear the rustle of their clothing as they moved. He closed his eyes, willing himself to disappear, to become invisible against the rocks. Then, the footsteps stopped. The silence was deafening, every sound in the forest magnified 1,000 times. He could hear the blood rushing in his ears, the frantic beating of his heart. He didn't dare move, didn't dare breathe, his entire being focused on staying hidden. The silence dragged on, the tension in the air thick enough to choke on. Alexander's mind raced, imagining every possible scenario. Would they find him? Would they drag him out from behind the rocks, guns aimed at his head? Or would they give up and move on, leaving him alone in the darkness of the forest? Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he heard the sound of footsteps retreating. The men were moving away, their voices growing fainter as they continued their search further down the hill. Relief washed over him in waves, but he knew he couldn't let his guard down. They were still out there, still hunting him, that he waited until the sound of their voices had completely faded before he dared to move. Slowly, carefully, he uncurled his body from behind the rocks, wincing at the pain in his ankle. He needed to get away, to put more distance between himself and his pursuers. But he was exhausted, his body battered and bruised, his energy reserves dangerously low. Gritting his teeth, he forced himself to stand, using the rocks for support. The pain in his ankle was intense, but he pushed it aside, focusing instead on the task at hand, escape. He limped forward, every step a test of his willpower, his eyes scanning the forest for any sign of danger. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sound the rustle of leaves in the breeze. The light was fading, the sun dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows that stretched across the forest floor. He knew he had to find shelter before nightfall, a place where he could rest and regroup, away from the prying eyes of his captors. That he moved slowly, cautiously, each step carefully placed to avoid making noise. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees towering above like silent sentinels. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, the enormity of what he was facing threatening to overwhelm him. But he couldn't afford to give in to despair. He had to keep moving, had to stay ahead of them. He pushed through the undergrowth, the branches clawing at his clothes, the damp earth sucking at his feet. His thoughts were a jumbled mess, a chaotic mix of fear, determination, and pain that he didn't know how long he had been walking when he finally stumbled upon a small, abandoned cabin nestled deep within the woods. It was barely more than a shack, its wooden walls weathered and rotting, the roof sagging dangerously in the middle. But it was shelter, a place where he could hide, at least for a little while. He limped toward the cabin, his legs trembling with exhaustion. The door creaked loudly as he pushed it open, the sound echoing through the quiet forest. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty, the air thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. Cobwebs hung in the corners, and the floor was covered in a thick layer of dust. But Alexander didn't care. All he could think about was getting off his feet, finding a place to rest. He collapsed onto the floor, the rough wooden boards digging into his back, but he barely felt it. His body was numb, his mind a fog of exhaustion and pain. He lay there for a long time, staring up at the cracked ceiling, his thoughts drifting in and out of focus. The events of the day played out in his mind like a nightmare he couldn't escape from. The ambush, the chase, the gunshots. It all seemed surreal, like something out of a bad dream. But it wasn't a dream. It was all too real, and he knew that the danger wasn't over yet. His captors were still out there, searching for him, and they wouldn't stop until they found him. He needed to rest to gather his strength, but he also knew that he couldn't stay in the cabin for long. As night fell, the forest outside the cabin came alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures. The hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves as a small animal scurried by, the distant howl of a wolf. Each sound set Alexander's nerves on edge, his body tense and ready to react. He closed his eyes, willing himself to sleep, to get at least a few hours of rest before he had to move again. But sleep was elusive, his mind too wired, too alert to relax. He kept thinking about his family, about the promise he had made to himself to survive, to find a way back to them. As the hours passed, Alexander drifted in and out of a restless sleep, his dreams filled with images of his captors, of his family, of the endless forest that seemed to go on forever. He awoke several times, his heart pounding, his body covered in a cold sweat. Each time, he would listen intently for any sound, any sign that the men had found him, but the forest remained quiet. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, he could no longer fight the exhaustion. His body gave in, and he slipped into a deep, dreamless sleep, the darkness of the cabin wrapping around him like a shroud. When he awoke, the sun was just beginning to rise, its light filtering through the cracks in the cabin walls. He felt stiff and sore, his muscles protesting as he slowly pushed himself up into a sitting position. His ankle throbbed painfully, but the rest had done him some good. His mind was clearer, his resolve stronger. He knew he couldn't stay in the cabin any longer. He had to keep moving, had to stay one step ahead of the men who were hunting him. But he also knew that he couldn't just run blindly through the forest. He needed a plan, a strategy to outsmart them. As he sat there, his back against the wall, he began to think about his options. The forest was vast and unforgiving, but it was also his ally. The dense undergrowth, the thick trees, the uneven terrain, all of it could be used to his advantage if he played his cards right. He remembered the layout of the forest from the drive the day before, the direction the car had been heading before he had made his escape. If he could find a way to double back, to throw them off his trail, he might be able to find a road or a river, something that would lead him to civilization. But first, he needed to take care of his ankle. The injury was slowing him down, making it difficult to move quickly or quietly. He looked around the cabin, his eyes scanning the interior for anything that might be useful. In the corner, he spotted an old, dusty blanket, its fabric worn but still intact. Using the blanket, he tore off a long strip of fabric, fashioning it into a makeshift bandage. He carefully wrapped it around his ankle, tying it tightly to provide some support. The pain was still there, but it was more manageable now, and he could walk with less difficulty. Satisfied with his work, Alexander gathered his strength and stood up, testing his weight on the injured ankle. It held, though the pain was still sharp. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for the journey ahead. He knew it would be dangerous, that every step he took could lead him closer to his captors. But he had no choice. He pushed open the cabin door, the morning light spilling into the dark interior. The forest outside was bathed in a soft, golden glow, the air crisp and cool. Alexander stepped out, his senses on high alert, listening for any sound, any movement that might signal the presence of his pursuers. But the forest was quiet, peaceful even, as if the danger of the day before had been nothing more than a bad dream. Alexander knew better, though. The men were still out there, still hunting him. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. With one last look at the cabin, he turned and began to make his way deeper into the forest, his footsteps careful and deliberate. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with danger and the unknown, but Alexander was determined to survive. He had escaped once, and he would do it again. He would find his way back to his family, no matter what it took. And so, he pressed on, the forest closing in around him as he disappeared into the shadows, the hunt far from over. The morning air was crisp and biting as Alexander Rowe emerged from the dense undergrowth, his body aching from the night spent in the dilapidated cabin. His ankle throbbed with every step, the makeshift bandage offering little relief from the sharp pain that shot up his leg with each movement. But the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the gnawing fear that gripped his heart. A fear that had taken root deep within him since his harrowing escape from the bandits the day before. He had managed to evade them through the thick forest, using the terrain to his advantage. But he knew they were still out there, searching for him with relentless determination. The forest, which had once seemed like a refuge, now felt like a labyrinth, its towering trees and tangled underbrush both concealing him and trapping him in a web of uncertainty. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig set his nerves on edge, his senses on high alert as he navigated through the shadows as the sun rose higher in the sky, casting long beams of light through the canopy. Alexander realized that he needed more than just his wits and determination to survive. He needed help. But where would he find it in this vast, isolated wilderness? The thought of seeking out others filled him with a strange mix of hope and dread. Hope that someone, anyone, might be able to assist him in his dire situation, and dread at the possibility that he might be walking into another trap, another encounter with the ruthless men who were hunting him. His thoughts turned to the people who lived in these remote areas. He had heard stories of reclusive individuals, hermits who had retreated from society to live in solitude, away from the noise and chaos of the modern world. Some said these people were kind and generous, willing to help those in need, while others warned of their mistrust of outsiders, their suspicion of anyone who dared to intrude upon their sanctuary. Alexander could only hope that if he did find someone, they would fall into the former category. The landscape began to change as he continued his journey, the dense forest gradually giving way to rolling hills and scattered clearings. The trees became sparser, allowing more sunlight to filter through, warming his chilled skin and lifting his spirits ever so slightly. He had been walking for hours, his pace slow and deliberate, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any sign of human habitation. He knew he couldn't keep this up indefinitely. His energy was waning, and the pain in his ankle was becoming harder to ignore. He needed to find help, and soon. Finally, as he crested a small hill, he caught sight of something that made his heart skip a beat. Nestled in a valley below was a small, weathered house, its roof sagging under the weight of years, the wooden walls bleached and cracked by the elements. Smoke curled lazily from a chimney, a thin wisp of gray that stood out starkly against the blue sky. The sight filled him with a surge of relief, a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, he had found what he was looking for. But as he stood there, gazing down at the house, doubt began to creep into his mind. Who lived there? Would they be willing to help him? Or would they turn him away, suspicious of his intentions? He had no way of knowing, and the uncertainty gnawed at him. But he had no other choice. He had to take the risk, had to trust that whoever lived there would have some shred of compassion, some willingness to assist a man in desperate need. With a deep breath, he began the slow descent down the hill, each step sending a jolt of pain through his ankle. As he approached the house, he noticed more details. An old, rusted truck parked beside the building, its tires flat and its paint peeling. A wooden porch that creaked and groaned with age. A small garden, overgrown and neglected, but still bearing a few hardy plants. The place had an air of abandonment, as if it had been forgotten by the world, left to decay in the silence of the wilderness. When he reached the front door, he hesitated, his hand hovering over the weathered wood. He could hear faint sounds from inside. Someone moving about, the clink of metal against metal, the murmur of a voice too low to make out. For a moment, he considered turning back, retreating into the forest and continuing his journey alone. But he knew that was foolish. He was injured, exhausted, and alone in an unfamiliar place. He needed help, and this might be his only chance to get it. Gathering his courage, he knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the quiet valley. For a few moments, there was no response, only the distant call of a bird and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. He knocked again, Harder this time, his heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the sweat trickling down his back, a mixture of exertion and fear. Finally, the door creaked open a few inches, and a face appeared in the narrow gap. It was an older man, his face weathered and lined, with a thick beard that matched the graying hair on his head. His eyes, sharp and piercing, locked onto Alexander, assessing him with a wary gaze. The man said nothing, just stood there, watching him, waiting for him to speak. "Please," Alexander croaked, his voice hoarse from lack of use. "I need help." The man's eyes narrowed slightly, suspicion flickering in their depths. He didn't open the door any further, but he didn't close it either. "What happened to you?" he asked, his voice gruff and low, like gravel crunching underfoot. Alexander hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. He didn't want to scare the man off, but he also knew he couldn't afford to lie. "I was attacked," he said, choosing his words carefully. "There were men. They tried to take me, but I escaped. I've been running for hours and I'm hurt. I need a place to rest, just for a little while." The man's expression didn't change, his eyes still fixed on Alexander, as if searching for any sign of deception. "Who are these men?" he asked after a long pause. "Why are they after you?" Alexander swallowed, his throat dry and scratchy. "They're dangerous," he said, trying to convey the seriousness of the situation without revealing too much. "I don't know why they're after me, but they won't stop until they find me. Please, I just need some time to rest, to figure out what to do next." For a moment, the man said nothing, his gaze shifting from Alexander to the forest beyond, as if considering the situation. Finally, he stepped back, opening the door a little wider. "Come in," he said, his tone reluctant but resigned. "But I can't promise you anything. If they come here looking for you, you're on your own." "Thank you," Alexander breathed, relief flooding through him. He stepped inside, the cool air of the house a welcome respite from the heat of the day. The interior was dimly lit, the only light coming from a small window on the far wall. The furnishings were sparse and utilitarian. A worn couch, a wooden table with mismatched chairs, a few shelves lined with dusty books and tools. It was clear that the man lived a simple, solitary life, far removed from the comforts of the modern world. The man closed the door behind him, locking it with a heavy bolt. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the couch. "You look like you could use it." Alexander nodded gratefully and limped over to the couch, sinking down onto the worn cushions with a sigh of relief. The man watched him for a moment before disappearing into another room, returning a few minutes later with a first aid kit and a bottle of water. "Drink," he said, handing Alexander the bottle. "You're dehydrated." Alexander took the bottle with shaking hands, unscrewing the cap and taking a long drink. The cool water soothed his parched throat, and he could feel some of his strength returning. He hadn't realized how thirsty he was until that moment. His body so focused on survival that it had ignored its most basic needs. The man knelt down beside him, opening the first aid kit and pulling out a roll of bandages. "Let me see your ankle," he said, his tone brisk and no nonsense. Alexander hesitated for a moment before lifting his leg, wincing as the movement sent a sharp pain through his ankle. The man carefully unwrapped the makeshift bandage, his rough hand surprisingly gentle as he examined the injury. "Looks like a bad sprain," the man said after a moment, his brow furrowed in concentration. "You're lucky it's not broken. I'll wrap it up for you, but you need to stay off it as much as possible." "Thank you," Alexander said again, his voice thick with gratitude. "I don't know what I would have done if I hadn't found you." The man didn't respond, his focus on rewrapping Alexander's ankle with the clean bandages. When he was finished, he stood up, his eyes meeting Alexander's for the first time since they had spoken at the door. "You can stay here for a bit," he said, his tone cautious. "But like I said before, if those men come looking for you, I won't risk my life for a stranger." "Understand?" "I understand," Alexander replied, nodding. "I'll leave as soon as I can walk." The man grunted in acknowledgement and turned to leave the room, pausing at the doorway. "Name's Frank, by the way," he said, glancing back at Alexander. "You?" "Alexander," he replied, offering a faint smile. "But my friends call me Alex." Frank gave a curt nod and disappeared into the other room, leaving Alexander alone on the couch. He leaned back, closing his eyes and letting out a long, slow breath. For the first time since the nightmare had begun, he felt a flicker of hope. He was still far from safe, still in danger, but at least for now, he had found a place to rest, to gather his strength and figure out his next move. As the day wore on, Alexander's mind began to clear, the fog of exhaustion lifting slightly. He thought about his family, about the life he had left behind, and a deep sense of longing washed over him. He missed them terribly, missed the comfort of their presence, the sound of their voices, the warmth of their embrace. He had to get back to them, had to find a way to escape the nightmare that had become his reality. But how? The men were still out there, searching for him, and he had no idea how to get back to civilization from this remote wilderness. He had no phone, no map, no way of knowing which direction to go. And even if he did manage to find a road or a town, there was no guarantee that the bandits wouldn't be waiting for him, lying in ambush. The uncertainty weighed heavily on him, a constant reminder of the precariousness of his situation. He knew he couldn't stay at Frank's house indefinitely, but he also knew that leaving too soon could be just as dangerous as staying. He had to be smart, had to think ahead, had to find a way to outmaneuver the men who were hunting him. That night, as he lay on the couch, his mind racing with thoughts and possibilities, he heard a noise outside, soft at first, barely perceptible, but growing louder as the minutes passed. It was the sound of footsteps, the crunch of gravel underfoot, the rustle of leaves in the breeze. His heart began to pound in his chest, a surge of adrenaline coursing through his veins. He strained to listen, every muscle in his body tensed, ready to spring into action. The footsteps were getting closer, moving slowly, deliberately, as if whoever was out there was trying to be as quiet as possible. He could feel the panic rising within him, a cold sweat breaking out on his skin. Was it the bandits? Had they found him? He didn't know what to do. Should he wake Frank or try to slip out of the house unnoticed? But where would he go? He could barely walk, let alone run. The footsteps stopped suddenly, just outside the window. Alexander held his breath, his heart pounding in his ears, the silence pressing down on him like a weight. He could hear the blood rushing in his head, the faint creak of the house settling, but nothing else. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. And then, without warning, the window shattered, glass flying everywhere as a figure burst through, landing heavily on the floor. Alexander scrambled to his feet, his ankle screaming in protest, but he barely registered the pain, his instincts taking over. The intruder lunged at him, a knife glinting in the dim light. Alexander ducked, the blade slicing through the air where his head had been just moments before. He grabbed a nearby chair and swung it at the attacker, the wood splintering as it connected with their shoulder. The man grunted in pain, but didn't go down, instead coming at Alexander with renewed fury. Alexander backed away, his mind racing, his body moving on autopilot. He had to defend himself, had to survive, but his options were limited, his injured ankle slowing him down. Just as the attacker closed in, the door to the other room flew open, and Frank appeared, a shotgun in hand. Without hesitation, he aimed and fired, the deafening roar of the gun echoing through the small house. The attacker went down, crumpling to the floor in a heap, the knife clattering from his hand. Alexander stared at the body, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The room was filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder, the silence that followed the gunshot heavy and oppressive. Frank lowered the shotgun, his face pale but composed. He glanced at Alexander, his eyes sharp and assessing. "You all right?" he asked, his voice steady but tinged with concern. Alexander nodded numbly, his hands shaking, his breath coming in ragged gasps. I think so," he stammered, his mind still reeling from the sudden violence. Frank moved over to the body, nudging it with his foot to make sure the man was dead. Satisfied, he looked back at Alexander. "We need to get you out of here," he said, his tone urgent. "If there's one, there's bound to be more. They'll come looking when he doesn't return." "Where can we go?" Alexander asked, his voice trembling. "They'll find us no matter where we hide." Frank's expression hardened, his jaw clenching. "I know a place," he said after a moment. "It's not far, but we need to move now, while we still have a chance." Alexander nodded, his fear and exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the face of the immediate danger. He knew Frank was right. They couldn't stay here, not after what had just happened. They had to move, had to find somewhere safer, somewhere the bandits wouldn't be able to reach them. As Frank gathered a few supplies and loaded the shotgun, Alexander took one last look at the lifeless body on the floor, the reality of the situation sinking in. He had narrowly escaped death once again, but the danger was far from over. The bandits were still out there, still hunting him, and they wouldn't stop until they had what they wanted. He didn't know what lay ahead, didn't know if they would survive the night, but he had no choice but to keep moving, to keep fighting. His life depended on it. With a final glance around the small, battered house, Alexander followed Frank out into the night, the darkness swallowing them up as they disappeared into the forest, the sound of distant footsteps echoing in their wake. The forest had grown darker, the trees casting long shadows that twisted and writhed in the dim light of the moon. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig seemed magnified, echoing in the silence that surrounded them. Alexander limped beside Frank, his mind still reeling from the events that had transpired in the small, weathered house they had just fled. The adrenaline that had fueled his movements was beginning to fade, replaced by a gnawing exhaustion that weighed heavily on his limbs. Frank moved ahead of him with purpose, his eyes scanning the surroundings for any signs of danger. He had barely spoken since they had left the house, his focus entirely on getting them to safety. The old man seemed to know these woods intimately, navigating the twisting paths and hidden trails with an ease that Alexander envied. But even Frank couldn't hide the tension in his posture, the urgency in his movements. They both knew that the bandits would be on their trail soon, if they weren't already. The pain in Alexander's ankle had become a constant, throbbing presence, each step sending a sharp jolt through his leg. But he pushed the discomfort aside, knowing that stopping wasn't an option. They had to keep moving, had to put as much distance between themselves and the house as possible. His thoughts were a chaotic jumble, the events of the past days playing over and over in his mind like a nightmare. He couldn't wake up from. He thought of the bandits, their cold, calculating eyes as they had dragged him from his car, the terror that had gripped him as he realized the gravity of the situation. He thought of the hours spent running through the forest, the fear that had driven him to push beyond his physical limits, and the overwhelming relief he had felt when he had found Frank's house. And then, the horror of the attack, the sound of the windows shattering, the sight of the intruder's lifeless body lying on the floor, a grim reminder of how close he had come to death. But through it all, one thought stood out above the rest, the thought of his family. The image of his wife and children, safe and unaware of the danger he was in, was the one thing that kept him going, the one thing that gave him the strength to keep moving forward. He had to survive, had to find a way out of this nightmare, for their sake if not for his own. Frank finally slowed his pace as they approached a narrow ravine, the walls of which were covered in thick, tangled vines. A small, hidden path led down into the darkness, the entrance barely visible beneath the overhanging branches. Frank stopped at the edge, turning to look at Alexander with a serious expression. "This way," he said, his voice low and urgent. "There's an old mining tunnel down here. It's been abandoned for years, but it's solid. We can hide there for a while, at least until we figure out our next move." Alexander nodded, too exhausted to argue, and followed Frank down the steep path. The air grew cooler as they descended, the thick canopy of trees overhead blocking out what little light remained. The sound of their footsteps echoed off the walls of the ravine, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence that surrounded them. At the bottom of the path, Frank led them to the entrance of the tunnel, a narrow opening in the rock face, partially obscured by overgrown vegetation. He pushed aside the vines, revealing a dark, gaping hole that seemed to swallow the light. Alexander hesitated for a moment, his instincts warning him against entering such a confined space, but he knew they had no other choice. They couldn't stay out in the open, not with the bandits still searching for them. Frank entered first, his figure quickly swallowed by the darkness. Alexander took a deep breath and followed, the cool, damp air of the tunnel wrapping around him like a shroud. The ground was uneven and slippery, the walls closing in on either side, making it difficult to move without brushing against the rough stone. He could hear the faint drip of water somewhere in the distance, the sound reverberating through the narrow passage. Frank led them deeper into the tunnel, finally stopping in a small, widened section that had clearly been used by miners long ago. Wooden beams supported the ceiling, their surfaces darkened by age and dampness. A few rusted tools lay scattered on the ground, forgotten remnants of a time when this place had been alive with activity. "This should do for now," Frank said, his voice echoing in the confined space. He set down his pack and began to pull out a few supplies. A flashlight, some food, a small blanket. "We'll rest here for a bit, but we can't stay too long. They'll be searching the area soon enough, and we need to keep moving." Alexander sank down onto the cold ground, leaning back against the rough wall of the tunnel. His body ached, his ankle throbbed, and his mind was a fog of exhaustion and fear. But he knew Frank was right. They couldn't afford to stay in one place for too long. The bandits were relentless, and it was only a matter of time before they found the tunnel. He had to think of something, had to come up with a plan to get them out of the situation. But his thoughts kept drifting back to his family, to the life he had left behind. He had never imagined that his life could take such a drastic turn, that he could go from being a successful businessman with a loving family to a fugitive, hiding in an abandoned mine from men who wanted him dead. It all seemed so surreal, so distant, like something out of a bad dream. But the pain in his ankle, the cold of the tunnel, the fear in his chest, they were all too real, a stark reminder that this nightmare was far from over. Frank sat down across from him, his expression thoughtful. "We'll need to find a way to get out of these woods," he said, breaking the silence. "There's a small town about 20 miles to the north, but it's risky. If the bandits are patrolling the area, we could run into them on the way." Alexander nodded slowly, trying to process the information. "What if we waited until nightfall?" he suggested. "It might be easier to avoid them in the dark." Frank considered this for a moment, then nodded in agreement. "That could work," he said, "but it'll be dangerous. The terrain is rough, and without light, it'll be easy to lose our way. We'll need to be careful, stay close to each other." The hours passed slowly as they waited in the tunnel, the oppressive darkness and silence weighing heavily on them. Alexander dozed fitfully, his dreams filled with images of the bandits, of his family, of the terrifying chase through the forest. Each time he woke, he was greeted by the same suffocating darkness, the same sense of dread that hung over them like a cloud. Finally, Frank decided it was time to move. He handed Alexander a small flashlight, the beam of light cutting through the inky blackness of the tunnel. "Stay close," he instructed, his voice barely above a whisper. "We can't afford to make any noise. If they're out there, we need to be as quiet as possible." Alexander nodded, his heart pounding in his chest as he followed Frank back through the narrow passage. The beam of the flashlight illuminated the rough, uneven ground, casting long, eerie shadows on the walls of the tunnel. Each step felt like an eternity, the sound of their footsteps muffled by the thick walls of the mine. When they finally emerged from the tunnel, the forest was cloaked in darkness, the trees towering overhead like silent sentinels. The air was cool and damp, a thin mist clinging to the ground, making the terrain even more treacherous. Frank led the way, his movements slow and deliberate, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings for any sign of danger. They walked for what felt like hours, the darkness pressing in on them from all sides. Alexander's ankle throbbed with each step, the pain nearly unbearable, but he gritted his teeth and kept moving. He knew they couldn't afford to stop. Not now, not when they were so close to getting out of the forest. The thought of his family, of the life he was desperate to return to, was the only thing that kept him going. As they continued their journey, the forest began to change, the trees thinning out, the underbrush becoming less dense. The terrain grew steeper, the ground rising into a series of rocky hills that were difficult to navigate in the dark. Frank slowed their pace, taking extra care with each step, the beam of his flashlight barely illuminating the path ahead. It was then that Alexander heard it, a faint rustling in the underbrush, followed by the unmistakable sound of voices. His heart leapt into his throat, his breath catching in his chest as he strained to listen. The voices were distant, but they were getting closer, the sound of footsteps echoing through the still night air. Frank froze, his hand shooting out to grab Alexander's arm, pulling him down into a crouch behind a large boulder. They sat there in silence, barely daring to breathe, as the voices grew louder, the footsteps drawing nearer. Alexander's mind raced, panic rising within him as he realized just how close they were to being discovered. The voices were clearer now, gruff, low, and tinged with a menacing edge. Alexander recognized the tone, the cold, detached manner of speech that he had heard from the bandits before. They were searching for him, combing the forest in a methodical, relentless way that sent a chill down his spine to Frank's grip on his arm tightened, and Alexander glanced at him, seeing the same fear reflected in the old man's eyes. They were trapped, caught between the rocky hillside and the bandits who were closing in on them. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and Alexander knew that if they were discovered, there would be no mercy. The minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity as the bandits continued their search, their voices growing louder, more insistent. Alexander could hear the crunch of boots on gravel, the rustle of leaves as they moved through the underbrush. He could feel the blood pounding in his ears, his heart racing as he waited for the inevitable. But then, as suddenly as they had come, the voices began to fade, the footsteps growing more distant. The bandits were moving away, their search taking them in a different direction. Alexander let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his body sagging with relief. They had been lucky, impossibly lucky, but he knew that their luck couldn't hold out forever. Frank motioned for him to stay low, and they slowly began to inch their way along the hillside, keeping to the shadows, moving as quietly as possible. Every sound seemed magnified in the stillness, every movement fraught with danger. But they continued on, driven by the desperate need to escape, to get out of the forest and away from the bandits who were hunting them. The night dragged on, the darkness unrelenting, the terrain growing more difficult with each passing hour. Alexander's ankle was a constant source of pain, every step sending a sharp jolt through his leg. But he forced himself to keep moving, knowing that stopping wasn't an option. Frank's pace slowed as well, the old man's exhaustion becoming more apparent as they climbed higher into the hills. Just when it seemed that they could go no further, the forest began to change again, the trees thinning out, the ground leveling off. The mist had lifted, revealing a clear night sky dotted with stars, the pale light of the moon casting a faint glow over the landscape. In the distance, Alexander could see the faint outline of a town, the lights twinkling like beacons in the darkness. "We're almost there," Frank whispered, his voice barely audible. "Just a little further, and we'll be safe." The sight of the town filled Alexander with a renewed sense of hope, a surge of energy that propelled him forward despite the pain and exhaustion. They were so close to finally escaping the nightmare that had consumed his life. He could almost see his family, waiting for him at the end of the journey, their faces filled with relief and joy. But just as they began to make their way down the hillside, the sound of voices returned, this time much closer, accompanied by the unmistakable click of a gun being cocked. Alexander froze, his heart plummeting as he realized that they had been discovered. The bandits had found them, and there was nowhere left to run. "Hold it right there," a voice barked, cold and commanding. "Don't move, or I'll blow your head off." Frank and Alexander slowly turned to face their pursuers, the beams of flashlights cutting through the darkness, illuminating the grim faces of the bandits. There were 3 of them, their expressions hard and unforgiving, their guns trained on the 2 men with deadly precision. Well, one of the bandits sneered, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "Look what we have here. You gave us quite a chase, but it looks like your luck just ran out." Alexander's mind raced, searching for a way out, but there was none. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and completely at the mercy of the bandits. He could feel the cold metal of the gun pressed against his back, the fear tightening around his chest like a vice. This was it, the end of the line. The bandit who had spoken stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he looked Alexander up and down. "You've caused us a lot of trouble. You know that?" he said, his voice dripping with malice. "But it's over now. Hand over the money, and maybe we'll let you live." Alexander swallowed hard, his mouth dry as he struggled to find his voice. I don't have any money, he said, his words barely above a whisper. I don't know what you're talking about. The bandit's expression darkened, his patience clearly wearing thin. Don't play dumb with me, he snapped, his hand tightening on the gun. We know you've got it. Now hand it over, or things are going to get real ugly real fast. I swear, I don't have anything, Alexander insisted, his voice trembling. Please, just let us go. We haven't done anything to you. The bandit's eyes flashed with anger, and he raised the gun, pressing it harder against Alexander's back. You think I'm stupid? You think I don't know a liar when I see one? You've got one last chance to tell me where the money is, or I'll. Before he could finish his threat, a loud gunshot rang out, echoing through the night. The bandit staggered, his eyes widening in shock as he looked down at the blood spreading across his chest. He collapsed to the ground, the gun slipping from his hand, his body twitching once before going still. The other bandits reacted immediately, raising their guns and firing in the direction of the shot. Alexander dropped to the ground, covering his head as bullets whizzed overhead, the night erupting into chaos. He could hear Frank shouting, the sound of gunfire reverberating through the trees, the sharp crack of bullets striking wood and stone. For a moment, it was all just noise and confusion, the world reduced to the deafening roar of gunfire and the blinding flash of muzzle flare. But then, as quickly as it had begun, the shooting stopped, the silence that followed almost more deafening than the noise had been. Alexander slowly raised his head, his heart pounding as he took in the scene around him. The bandits were down, their bodies lying motionless on the ground, blood pooling beneath them. Frank stood over them, his face grim, the barrel of his shotgun still smoking. We need to move, Frank said, his voice low and urgent. Now! Alexander nodded, too stunned to speak, and quickly scrambled to his feet. They didn't stop to check the bodies, didn't look back as they made their way down the hillside and into the outskirts of the town. The streets were deserted, the houses dark and silent. But the sight of civilization, of safety, filled Alexander with a sense of relief so profound it was almost overwhelming. They found a small motel on the edge of town, the neon sign flickering in the darkness. Frank paid for a room in cash, and they quickly made their way inside, locking the door behind them. Alexander collapsed onto the bed, his body finally giving in to the exhaustion that had been threatening to overtake him for hours. Frank sat down in a chair by the window, his eyes scanning the street outside, ever vigilant. We'll rest here for the night, he said quietly. Tomorrow we'll figure out our next move. Alexander nodded, his eyelids heavy, his mind clouded with fatigue. He wanted to thank Frank, to say something, anything, to express the gratitude he felt for everything the old man had done for him. But the words wouldn't come, and before he could try again, sleep claimed him, pulling him down into a deep, dreamless abyss. When he woke the next morning, the sun was shining through the thin curtains, the room filled with the warm, golden light of a new day. For a moment, he didn't know where he was, his mind struggling to piece together the events of the past days. But then it all came rushing back, the memories crashing over him like a wave, and he sat up with a start, his heart pounding in his chest. Frank was gone. The chair by the window was empty, the room silent and still. A note lay on the small table by the bed, written in Frank's neat, precise handwriting. Alexander, it read, I've got to take care of a few things. Stay here until I return. If I'm not back by sundown, go to the police station in town and tell them everything. They'll help you. Don't worry. You're safe now. Frank. Alexander stared at the note for a long moment, his mind racing. He knew he should feel relieved, should feel safe, but instead, a deep sense of unease settled over him. Something wasn't right. Frank's sudden disappearance, the cryptic note, the fact that they were still in a town so close to the forest where the bandits had found them. It all felt wrong. Like the calm before a storm, he stood up, wincing as the pain in his ankle flared up again, and limped over to the window. The street outside was quiet, the town peaceful in the morning light, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, that the danger was far from over.